Hi class, it's Mrs. Edie. Today we're going to be talking about figurative language. Now there are many different types of figurative language, and today we're just going to be focusing on two main types of figurative language, one being a simile and the other being a metaphor. These are the standards that we'll be covering today. It is your language standards for 4th grade to demonstrate understanding of figurative language, word relationships, and nuances in word meanings. We're going to be focusing on the letter A that comes along with this standard, explaining the meaning of simple similes and metaphors in context. You have two I can statements for today's lesson. The first is, I can explain the meaning of simple similes. And the second, I can explain the meaning of simple metaphors. Now, I'm sure you're wondering what the answer to this question is. What is a simile? So let's talk about what does the word simile even mean. A simile is a comparison using the words like or as to compare two things to each other. One example of a simile is he runs like the wind. As you notice, that simile uses the word like to compare the boy running to the wind. Another example of a simile is her eyes were as blue as the sky. As you can see, this is comparing a girl's eyes with the color of the sky and uses the word as to compare those two things. These are both examples of similes. Now, what does a simile mean? Let's talk a little bit about how we can interpret a simile to figure out what our author is actually trying to tell us. Let's talk about our first example. He runs like the wind. Now, in order to figure out what the author is trying to tell us with this statement, we need to think about what does wind do that the author could be talking about when he's comparing it to running. So we all know that wind moves very fast. Moves so fast it makes a whistling sound sometimes. So we know that wind is very fast moving. We can assume that when the author says he runs like the wind, he means to tell us that he runs very fast. Let's look at our next example. Her eyes were as blue as the sky. Now, what could that mean? Let's think about the color of the sky. Her eyes are being compared to the color of the sky. You know how blue the sky is, and if you don't, you can go outside and look and see how blue the sky is. And then you can take that color and in your mind put that in the color of the character's eyes. You know that her eyes are blue like the sky is blue. It gives us a very clear description of the color of that character's eyes. All right, now let's move on and talk about what is a metaphor. Metaphor is kind of a fancy word, and I'm sure you're wondering what it means. So let's get into what a metaphor is. A metaphor is a comparison that does not use like or as. Now here's a little helpful hint for you. Most or many metaphors use a to be verb. Now the to be verbs include am, are, is, was, and were. So sometimes you will see a verb like that instead of the word like or as, and that indicates that you're seeing a metaphor and not a simile. It's still a comparison, but it does not use the words like or as to compare. Here's an example. The hospital was a refrigerator. That's an example of a metaphor. You can see that it's comparing the hospital to a refrigerator using the word was, a to be verb. What does a metaphor mean? Let's practice interpreting the meaning of these comparisons. It can be a little bit more challenging to to figure out the meaning of a metaphor than a simile because it uses a to be verb, which can make it seem a little bit more confusing, but you can figure it out. So here's our first example of our metaphor. The hospital was a refrigerator. Now, is the hospital actually a refrigerator? No, of course not. That would be dangerous if we were keeping sick people in a refrigerator, right? Refrigerators, though, the very first thing we think of when we think of a refrigerator is we think that they're very cold. So this metaphor is telling us that the hospital was very cold, much like a refrigerator. It's not an actual refrigerator, but it is cold like a refrigerator. The metaphor is just taking one characteristic of a refrigerator, the fact that it's cold, and comparing that to a hospital to show us how very cold the hospital was. Now, why do authors use similes and metaphors in their writing? let's talk about this. Why would an author even need to use a simile or a metaphor? The first reason is that similes and metaphors describe things in a very interesting way. As you can see, this gentleman's very excited about what he's reading because he probably read a description using an amazing simile or metaphor. It is much more interesting to read words like, her eyes were as blue as the sky, rather than to read words that say, her eyes were blue. It's much more interesting and gives us a deeper understanding. Another reason that an author might use a simile or a metaphor is to give the reader a picture of what the author is trying to say. They give us a very specific image in our mind. For example, in the simile, her eyes were blue, her eyes were as blue as the sky, it gives us a much more specific picture of how blue her eyes are. If it just said her eyes are blue, we might imagine any shade of blue, a darker blue or a grayish blue. But when the author says her eyes were as blue as the sky, we know that they're the color the sky is, that pure blue color. So it gives us a very specific picture of what her eyes look like. All right, similes are also used to show instead of tell. Now this is something that we've talked about a lot in our writing, showing instead of telling, because it makes our writing more interesting and richer for our readers. So if I read the words, he runs fast, I would think, oh, he's fast. It would just give me information about him being fast, which is great, but it doesn't get my mind involved in what I'm reading. On the other hand, if I read, he runs like the wind, I think of this specific image of a boy flying through this area that he's running through with his hair blowing back in the wind and dust going up behind him. It gives me this picture of him running like the wind. Which I would not get from just the simple words, he runs fast. So it's another reason that authors might use this literary device of a simile or a metaphor to show us a picture in our mind instead of telling us information. All right, now let's try. I want you to see if you can figure out what this simile means. It says, he popped out of his seat like a toaster strudel. Now here's a picture of a toaster down here. I want you to think about what a toaster strudel would do. Now I'm going to give you just a moment to think about what you think this character is doing that is being compared to a toaster strudel. Okay, let's find out. He popped out of his seat like a toaster strudel. A toaster strudel pops out of a toaster quickly. I don't know if you've had any experience making a toaster strudel, but when it pops out of the toaster, it comes up very fast, makes kind of a loud noise sometimes, can be a little surprising. So, as the character is being compared to a toaster strudel, that means that he popped out of his seat quickly. He stood up from his chair very quickly. And that's exactly what that simile means, but it tells us in such a more interesting way than just saying he stood up quickly. All right, let's try a metaphor now. Let's think about what this one means. It says, the clerk listened to his story with a stone face. And I want you to think about, is the clerk's face really made of stone? There's a picture of stone there for you to think about. Take a minute and think about, what is this metaphor trying to tell us? All right, let's find out. The clerk listened to his story with a stone face. Now, stone is hard and cold. We know that. So that means that the clerk's face looked hard and cold. Now, let's think about what a hard and cold facial expression really means. That would mean that the clerk is not smiling, possibly frowning, and probably looks uncaring and maybe even a little angry. Like this man on this slide looks pretty serious, a serious face, not happy to hear the story, right? Very serious and maybe even a little upset with the person who's telling the story. It was such an interesting way to describe that clerk's facial expression without telling us he was frowning, his eyebrows were over his eyes, but just giving us a mental image of him having a stone face. All right, let's review very quickly. Similes and metaphors are comparisons, both in different ways. Similes use the words like and as to compare two things. Metaphors do not use like or as. Sometimes they use those to be verbs. A lot of the time they do. Sometimes they do not, but they do not use like or as ever. That's how you will know if it's a metaphor or a simile. And of course, we learned that authors use similes and metaphors to describe things in an interesting way that shows the reader a picture instead of just telling the reader information. I thank you so much for watching. I hope that this will help you as we move on to our next novel study to be able to identify and interpret the meaning of similes and metaphors. Have a great day.